All right. Good morning, afternoon, whatever it is in your world. So we're going to start the course by talking about ancient ethics. So why don't we first talk about what we mean by ancient? So history, for our purposes, is in this course is going to be divided into ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary. So imagine an historical timeline, thusly, to the year 476 A.D. This is what a lot of historians would pick as a date that ends the ancient period, because this is the fall of the city of Rome. Now, it's not, as if in 477 A.D. on December 31st, everyone was watching their watches for the end of the ancient period. I mean, these things take decades, if not centuries. But this is a convenient year for historians to sort of bookend, because in 476, Rome, which had been in decline for some time and had been sacked a couple of times by Germans, was finally taken over once and for all by Theodoric the Visigoth, who proclaimed himself king of Rome. Okay, so before that time, when we talk ancient, we can talk all the way back to the first peoples in the Tigris and Euphrates River. We're talking, 8,000-10,000 years ago, through the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, all these people. For us, though, our story is going to start with the Greeks. And the Greek Empire sort of did this: a rise to a certain level of luxury and power, and then a falling off, a disintegration. And after the Greeks, the Romans did sort of the same thing. Started out small, became a huge empire, disintegrated, and fell apart until 476 AD. So for us, the authors that we're going to be looking at in terms of ancient ethics are largely going to be Greek. And since this isn't a history course, we're not going to get too heavy into all of the historical ins and outs, although it is interesting. But for the most part, the Romans came to emulate and copy a lot of Greek philosophy, ethics, art, even motifs of architecture, the whole nine yards. So what we learn about the Greeks was transferred really to Roman culture. So for us, the ancient period is largely going to consist of the Greeks and Romans, but specifically the Greeks. Now, we can call this area within the ancient period as the classical period. And I just want to make sure that we point this out, because classical refers to specifically the time in which the Greeks and the Romans flourished as artistic and literary cultures. The ancient world comprises a lot more history before the Greeks, but we're not going to deal with it. So if you are familiar with, the Bible and the ancient mythologies in that period, we're not dealing with them. We're starting with the Greeks. So we're really beginning with classical ancient philosophy. And so one of the big things that we're going to be looking at with the Greeks in terms of ethics is, well, one, they discovered it. They're the first ones to write extensively about ethics. But the Greeks also were the civilization that discovered, produced, whatever you want to call it, philosophy. And this is important. Philosophy literally means the love of wisdom. Right? Philo means love, a certain type of love. And Sophia means wisdom. And so philosophy equals the love of wisdom. This was coined by Socrates. The significance is this: before philosophy, there was mythology. And so we could look, I'm sure you're familiar with Greek mythology, because thanks to Disney, it's starting to come back. Various movies about Hercules and all these other guys, and Hollywood in general. But mythology attempts to understand the world through telling of stories. On one level, you could say that myth is a bunch of lies, right? And indeed, that's sort of one way to understand it. However, these are stories that try to explain difficult truths. So mythology is a lot more complex and fundamental than just a bunch of stories. However, at a certain point in history, around 650 BC or so, the Greeks specifically began to realize that there were better ways to understand the universe than mythology. Beginning with a guy by the name of Thales, Greeks began to think of the world not so much about stories of the gods, but rather based on human reason and observation. And that is really the birth of philosophy. And so essentially, what philosophy is what we would call now science. And so the first philosophers, the likes of Thales and Democritus and Anaximander, there's a whole bunch of these guys, which we're not going to get into, but the point is, although their conclusions were often weird, for the most part, they tried to understand the world in terms of human reason and observation, rather than stories of gods and the supernatural. That's crucial. So when we talk about ancient ethics, the point is we're trying to understand ethics as essentially a science. That's the deal. And so the ancient Greeks were the first ones to systematically think about, well, what is a good life based on human reason? In other words, it's not based on what the priests and the gods tell us we should do, but rather what logical arguments we can put forward to give us good conclusions about what is a good life. And so at the end of the day, what we'll find in ancient ethics is a tremendous reliance on reason and argumentation, and especially in the ancient period, we'll see ethics become a systematic science. And in fact, really, it was the Greeks who invented what we now call ethics. So that is where we will begin our investigation in the ancient world of ethics. We're going to be looking at two very important authors, Plato and Aristotle. Plato was put to death in 399 BC, to give you some sort of chronology, and Aristotle died, I think, in 323 BC or something. Don't quote me on that, but approximately that time. And between these two individuals, Plato and Aristotle, who we could situate in terms of the Greek timeline right about here, they witnessed, especially Socrates, who is in these dialogues by Plato, as we'll see. Socrates lived through Periclean Athens. If you see on my chart right here, I've circled this area. And Pericles, one could say, who was what's called the Archon king, close enough for our purposes, well, president would be better, who was the greatest president or leader of Athens. Socrates was alive during his lifetime. Pericles died in 429 BC, and most people conclude that the death of Pericles was pretty much the demise of Athens. When Athens fell apart, not much longer did Sparta fall apart, and the whole world was taken over by the Macedonians. All that stuff, again, interesting but not so important. My point is that ethics really begins as a systematic science at the height of Athens' power, and very shortly after Athens falls apart. However, a lot of that thinking, as we said, is transferred to the Roman culture. And so we'll see it reemerge when we talk about people like Marcus Aurelius and stuff, who really are emulating what the Greeks had written sometime before. So there's a brief overview for us of the ancient world. We're mainly going to be looking at the Greeks, and the Greeks who turned ethics into a science. And that is where we will start by looking at Plato.